I live and work in Snowdonia. I manage a farm called Arwyn, which is a hill farm. It was bought by the National Trust 13 years ago. And it was bought following a public appeal. £5 million were raised, hundreds, thousands of people contributed. So in effect, I'm a farmer with stakeholders. A lot of people have got an interest in the farm. And it's also a farm where one of the main parts of the summit of Snowdon goes through the heart of our land. So between 60 and 80,000 people a year would literally walk through the middle of Havertown. As you can see, Havertown is a typically Welsh hill farm. Like so many of my neighbours, we're dependent on sheep production. And when I started on my Nuffield journey and I was thinking of my study topic, for me, I suppose, looking in that direction was a natural thing to do. We keep 2,000 sheep in 3 hefted flocks, separately hefted flocks. And they graze up to the summit of Snowdon, literally up to the Caffey. And each of those flocks really is kept according to the traditional way of sheep hefting. Now, 2 years ago when I started on the journey, there was a lot of concern about sheep production in the sense that sheep numbers in the UK have declined by 30% over the last 20 years. And when I cast my eye a little further, I could see that that statistic was common to a lot of countries. So I decided on my topic, and from there on, I started to think about where I was going to go. But I was also fortunate in the sense that my Nuffield study has been sponsored by the company of the Masters of the Stable of England, which took us back as well to the 13th century. 1359, the company was founded. Its fortunes was built on the sheep industry, and that company has been tremendously supported globally. I feel I've gained a lot from my relationship with my sponsors. And as I say, that took me back to that period where the sheep industry really did have a big economic impact on this country. So that was a starting point. Now, interestingly, when I started to delve a little bit more, when you start looking at the statistics, I'd always assumed that sheep were found in Europe, they were found in Australia, New Zealand. I couldn't be more wrong in the sense that that dominance doesn't exist. 80% of the world's sheep are found in developing countries. Only 20% are found in developed countries. So the natural starting point then was to go to a developing country. And the developing country I went to was China. China has got the most sheep in the world, 135 million. If the statistics are to be believed. And there you can see one of our first stops in China was, we travelled up to Inner Mongolia, to a place called Hot. And this was a government research station where effectively they'd been importing sheep from Australia and were attempting to improve the genetic base of their sheep flock. Now, the Chinese sheep industry is fascinating. The more I've learnt about it, the more surprised I am. The more awestruck I am about the country. In the sense that 135 million sheep, of those 32% are in flocks of between 1 and 4. 40% are in flocks of between 4 and 49. Now, in terms of consumption, again, my purpose in going was to see what the potential was, because in Wales we're getting excited about China. We think there's a lot of talk. Maybe, given the population, maybe there'll be big opportunities there. And in terms of consumption, that was, again, equally fascinating. In the north, they consume 7 kilograms of sheep meat a year. In the south, it's 0.25. But more interestingly, when you look again at, or delve even further, in urban areas, they consume 3 kilograms. In rural areas, it's just over a kilogram. Their disposable income is much greater in urban areas. And given the rate of urbanisation in China, you sort of start to think, well, maybe there will be big opportunities there. Now, that consumption, really, a lot of that sheep meat is eaten in the form of hot pot, which isn't the hot pot we're familiar with. It's hot pot whereby meat is dipped in oil and water. And the one thing I came from China with was obviously an amazement at the speed of the development, at the country, at the agriculture, and obviously at the potential. But in terms of the sheep meat sector, it was the low value cuts is what they consume. And I think for us, that was one message, that are opportunities, but it's the nets, the offers, etc., where those opportunities lie. So from China, I moved on to Australia and New Zealand. And Australia and New Zealand, they export, whereas developing countries buy 10% of the sheep. New Zealand, Australia, they export 80% of the sheep meat trade. So again, it was a natural place to go in that in terms of the world market. They generate that market and they supply that market largely. When I arrived in Australia, they were lambing in November, and llamas and alpacas were the thing that took my eye, because I'd worked in Australia 20 years previously, and when I was looking on the lambing fields, there were lots of llamas and alpacas guarding the flocks. Now, in terms of that sheep flock, again, compared to what I'd seen 20 years previously, the thing that struck me was there was a lot less sheep. Sheep numbers have declined from 160 million in Australia to 70 million. But that's largely wool-producing sheep. Meat production is still relatively stable, or actually has been increasing. And the factors at play in terms of the sheep industry there are the volatility of the wool price. Obviously, that to some extent has been dictated as well by the weather. The weather was a second thing, or climate has obviously had a big impact on all aspects of Australian agriculture. Thirdly, I found there farmers who were sheep farmers, but as they got older, and an ageing farming population was something that was affecting them, as they got older, were swapping or changing to beef. Whereas back in Wales, the tendency is for farmers to move from beef to sheep because of the workload as they get older. In Australia, it's the reverse. They go from sheep to cattle because they've got extensive cattle systems outside, so it was an easier way of life for them. And other land uses as well was having a big impact. And while I was there, my time was focused around Arndale, and I visited many of the research establishments there, University of New England, the CSIRO, which is the Scientific Research Station, and the Sheep CSE, which is really a conglomerate of all sheep breeding organisations that come together. And unfortunately, time doesn't permit me to go into detail about what I saw there. But from there, I moved on to New Zealand, again, a country synonymous with sheep production. Sheep numbers there have reduced from 70 million down to 32 million, but again, lamb production is relatively static. Well, actually, they've maintained production even though numbers have declined. Lamb weaning weights, lamb selling weights have increased substantially. And again, as in Australia, what was happening there was that you're finding that land which was previously sheep was being devoted to other land uses. The economics of sheep production, they were finding it difficult to compete with other land uses. But in terms of what I took from New Zealand, again, there was so much, but certainly the one thing I found was that the marketing was very sophisticated. They were very aware of the potential of each market. Each market, obviously, they've got a voluntary restraint agreement with Europe, but they also export to Asia, America, and each market, they knew exactly what the value of each was. And again, coming back to developing markets, such as China, what I learned in New Zealand was that a ton of sheep meat coming to Europe for the New Zealanders was worth 10,000 New Zealand dollars. A ton going to China was worth 6,000 New Zealand dollars. Again, because of the relative value. Now, this is an interesting slide in the sense that this guy moved to New Zealand from New York. He sold 200 acres, 200-acre farm in New York to buy a 30,000-acre sheep farm in New Zealand. And this was on weaning day out in Castle Point in the North Island. But he, I think, epitomised many. He was committed to the sheep industry. He moved out to New Zealand and felt that there was a very bright future for the industry. And I think, coming back to my own situation, since I've come back, the first thing that I did was we were lambing, and we always lose 35 to 40 lambs per year to foxes. So the first thing I did was bought some alpacas, so for the Snowden now, you'll see alpacas. We've looking at land capability. We're looking in much more objective manner at what we're doing with our land in terms of the sheep production areas, how we manage those, how we integrate conservation and farming. And certainly for me as well, in terms of going around and talking to family groups, the big message is, in terms of developing countries, there's huge potential out there. And I think for the sheep industry, there's certainly huge potential. But I think we have to be careful. We need to look, we need to understand what these markets offer us, and approach them in that manner. And I'm quite sure, having spent 2 years on my study, and having seen during that period sheep prices increase quite substantially, I'm quite sure we've got a good future. And with that, can I thank you and certainly the Nuffield Foundation for this opportunity. It's been a fantastic opportunity, and I certainly have enjoyed these past 2 years, and I've got an awful lot out of this experience. Thank you.